If you've ever hired a wedding videographer, I need you to hear this before you watch anything else I post. Somewhere, right now, a stranger might be watching the worst 5 minutes of your marriage. Not because it leaked. Not because someone hacked a hard drive. Because it was sold. On purpose. Licensed, tagged, and priced by the minute, sitting in a digital catalog next to stock footage of sunsets and city traffic and golden retrievers running through fields. I know that sounds like the premise of a thriller. I wish it were. My name is Rachel, and 18 months ago, I found our wedding videographer's business account on a stock footage marketplace, and inside a folder labeled Authentic Emotional Content, Couples, I found us. Not our first dance. Not our vows. Not the part where my husband, Josh, cried reading his own handwriting because he'd been too nervous to say the words out loud even once before that day. I found the fight. The one from the night before the wedding, in the hotel hallway, when we thought no one was filming, about his mother, about money, about whether either of us was actually ready for what we were about to do in front of 200 people the next morning. Raw. Unedited. Time-stamped. Available for commercial license, starting at $49. What I didn't know yet, standing in our kitchen with my laptop screen glowing at 11 at night, was that this discovery wasn't the end of the story. It was barely the beginning. Because once we pulled that thread, it kept unraveling, through a false suspect, through a stranger who reached out with information that changed everything, through nearly a dozen other couples living the exact same nightmare without knowing it had a name. This is the story of how we found it, who we almost blamed instead, and the much colder, much bigger thing we uncovered once we stopped assuming this had only ever happened to us. I want to tell you about who Marcus was before I tell you what he did, because if I don't, none of what happens next will make sense. You don't hand a stranger unsupervised access to the most vulnerable day of your life. You hand it to someone who's earned it, slowly, in 100 small moments of feeling seen rather than watched. We found Marcus almost a year before the wedding, through a friend who'd used him for her own ceremony and described his work in a way I still remember word for word. She said, "He doesn't film weddings. He films the parts everybody else edits out." She showed me a highlight reel he'd made for her, and it wasn't the choreographed first dance or the bouquet toss. It was her father, standing in a hallway alone for 4 seconds before walking her down the aisle, visibly working to hold himself together. It was a candid shot of her new mother-in-law crying during the toast, not performing emotion for the camera, just having it, unguarded. It was beautiful. It was intimate. It was, I understand now, exactly the kind of footage that has a very specific commercial value if you strip the names off it. We met Marcus for a consultation at a coffee shop near our apartment. He was warm, easy to talk to, the kind of person who asks a follow-up question instead of waiting for his turn to speak. He asked about how Josh and I met, laughed at the right places, and at one point set his phone face down on the table without being asked, which I remember specifically registering as a small, meaningful signal. This is a man who understands presence. He told us, unprompted, that his whole philosophy was, no performing for the camera. He wanted couples to forget he was there, so what he captured would be real instead of staged. At the time, I thought that was the entire pitch. In hindsight, it was also the entire method, and I've since had a lot of time to sit with how effective it is to build trust by seeming to disappear. We signed a contract. I remember reading it, not thoroughly, the way you never thoroughly read anything when you're 11 weeks from a wedding and drowning in seating charts and whether your aunt's dietary restrictions could be accommodated by the caterer, but enough to see the standard language, full access to the day, unrestricted filming during designated hours, a licensing clause granting him rights to use select footage for his professional portfolio and promotional materials. That clause felt normal. Every photographer and videographer we'd researched had some version of it. You expect your engagement photos to end up on their Instagram. You don't expect the argument you had about your mother-in-law to end up for sale to a beverage company for a commercial about authentic moments. Marcus also asked, during that same consultation, whether we'd be comfortable with him arriving the evening before the ceremony to capture what he called arrival energy, guests settling into the hotel, the rehearsal dinner, the quiet hours where everyone's guard comes down a little. At the time, that request read as thoroughness. A dedicated professional wanting the fullest possible record of our story. I've thought about that specific phrase more times than I can count since. The quiet hours where everyone's guard comes down. He told us that himself, in the very first meeting, and we thanked him for his dedication. The wedding day itself, Marcus was everywhere and nowhere, the way good documentary videographers are. He caught the calm before the ceremony, the hallway where Josh and I accidentally saw each other early and just stood there laughing about breaking our own no-peeking rule. He caught my father's toast, the parts of it he clearly hadn't planned to say out loud, voice cracking on my mother's name because she'd passed 3 years earlier and wasn't there to see it. He caught things I didn't even know had happened until I saw the footage months later, my niece falling asleep under a table. During the reception, my 2 aunts having what looked like a genuinely tender reconciliation near the bar after years of not speaking, my husband's grandfather, 91 years old, quietly teaching one of the younger cousins a dance step from what he later told us was his own wedding, 68 years earlier. And somewhere in the 18 hours he spent with a camera pointed at our lives that week, he also caught the fight. It happened the night before the wedding, in the hallway outside our hotel rooms, past 11 at night. We'd assumed Marcus was done for the day. He'd wrapped the rehearsal dinner coverage hours earlier and told us he was heading back to his own hotel. What we didn't know, what we wouldn't learn for another year and a half, was that Marcus had a habit, one he'd apparently developed over dozens of weddings, of keeping a small, unobtrusive camera running in common areas near where couples were staying, capturing what he called, in his own internal file naming convention we'd eventually discover, ambient authentic content. Hallways. Parking lots. Anywhere 2 people might have an unguarded moment he could later claim, technically, he hadn't been actively operating the camera for, since it had simply been left recording. The fight itself was nothing unusual, if you've ever been engaged. Pre-wedding stress compounding months of unresolved tension, his mother's difficult relationship with the wedding planning, a disagreement about how much we'd spent versus what we'd budgeted, the particular exhaustion of 2 people who love each other completely and are also, that week, at the absolute edge of what they can emotionally carry. We said things. We apologized. We fell asleep separately that night and woke up the next morning and got married anyway, because that's what real love actually looks like sometimes, not the absence of conflict, but choosing each other through it, tired and imperfect and still willing. I didn't think about that hallway again for over a year. Why would I? It was private. It was ours. It was, we thought, unrecorded, a memory that existed only in the 2 of us, the way most hard nights in a relationship do, softened by time into something we could eventually laugh about together, the way you do with the stories from the week before a wedding that nobody prepares you for. In the months after the wedding, Marcus stayed loosely in our lives the way vendors sometimes do when the working relationship went well. He liked our anniversary photos on social media. He sent a brief, warm message when we posted about buying our first house together, something about how excited he was to have documented the beginning of it all. I remember feeling grateful, at the time, that we'd found someone who seemed to genuinely care about our story rather than simply moving on to the next client the moment the invoice cleared. I think about those messages differently now. I think about how easy it must have been for him to keep tabs on couples whose private footage he was actively continuing to license, under the guise of warmth, long after the actual working relationship had ended. The first sign something was wrong didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like coincidence, the kind you laugh off before you understand it isn't one. About 14 months after the wedding, a coworker of mine was building a slide deck for a corporate presentation and mentioned, in passing, that she'd been scrolling through a stock footage site looking for real-feeling relationship content, something to illustrate a point about workplace conflict resolution, of all things. She said, half joking, "It's wild what people will film and sell of themselves. There's a whole genre of authentic couple argument footage now. It's apparently really in demand for ads that want to look raw instead of staged." I laughed along with her. I didn't think about it again that day. But something about the phrase stayed lodged somewhere in the back of my mind. Authentic couple argument footage. A category. An entire commercial genre built on capturing the thing people spend their lives trying to keep private. A few weeks later, entirely unrelated, Josh and I were reviewing our full wedding footage archive, the raw files Marcus had delivered on a hard drive along with the edited highlight reel, standard practice so couples have everything, not just the polished version. We rarely opened that drive. It was enormous, disorganized, hours upon hours of unedited material. But we were looking for one specific clip, a toast from Josh's uncle we wanted to send to a cousin who'd missed the wedding, and in scrolling through the file directory, I noticed something odd. The file names didn't match our wedding date structure the way I expected. Most of the footage was labeled the way you'd expect: ceremony_take 1, reception_dance floor, toast_uncle_Dave. But buried in a subfolder labeled B-roll miscellaneous, there were files with generic, almost clinical names. Hallway_conflict_01. Hallway_conflict_02. 2 files, timestamped the night before our wedding, in a folder that otherwise contained ambient shots of hotel corridors and parking lots, the kind of filler footage you'd expect an editor to use for transitions, not content. I opened the first file expecting nothing. I got us. The whole fight, start to finish, filmed from what I now understood was a fixed camera angle near the ice machine at the end of our hotel hallway, not Marcus manually shooting us, which somehow would have felt less violating, but a camera he'd simply left running, capturing whatever happened to walk into frame. I sat on our bedroom floor and watched 22 minutes of the rawest night of our engagement, filmed without our knowledge, sitting quietly in a folder on our own hard drive for over a year, and I felt something shift, not yet anger, not yet fear, just a cold, specific unease. If he filmed this without telling us, what else had he filmed? And why did he keep it? I didn't think, yet, about where else it might exist. That thought came later, and it came from Josh, though not directly. It came, first, from a mistake we almost made that I still feel embarrassed about. Before we ever suspected Marcus of anything beyond a strange filming habit, we suspected someone else entirely, and I think this part matters, because it shows how disorienting it is to realize the person who betrayed you isn't the person your instincts point to first. The hotel where we'd stayed the night before the wedding had a wedding coordinator on staff, a woman we'd interacted with briefly during setup, whose assistant, we learned much later, entirely unrelated to any of this, had once been let go from a previous job amid vague rumors of some kind of privacy complaint from a different client. Josh had heard this secondhand from a friend who'd used the same venue, and for almost a full week after finding the hallway footage, we built an entire theory around hotel staff: someone with hallway camera access, someone with a motive we didn't understand, someone who'd installed something without our knowledge or the videographers. We spent days on this theory. Josh emailed the hotel's corporate office asking about their hallway security footage policies. I drafted, and nearly sent, an accusatory message to the coordinator directly. We were building an entire narrative around the wrong person, because it felt, somehow, more plausible than the alternative, that the man we'd handed our vows to, who'd cried a little himself during Josh's toast, who'd hugged us both goodbye at the end of the night and told us it had been an honor to document our story, was the one who'd left that camera running. The theory fell apart when Josh, cross-checking the video's metadata out of thoroughness rather than suspicion, found the file's embedded device information. It hadn't come from any hotel security system. It had come from a camera register. Under Marcus's own equipment inventory, the same model he'd used throughout the wedding, confirmed by comparing the device ID against metadata from footage we knew, without question, he'd shot himself. I remember the specific feeling of that moment more than almost anything else in this entire story, not the shock of the accusation itself, but the shame of how badly we'd wanted it to be anyone else. We'd built an entire alternate suspect out of hope. It's a strange thing to notice about yourself, how far your mind will go to avoid believing the person you trusted did the thing they did. Once that theory collapsed, there was nowhere left to look but directly at Marcus, and nowhere left to go but forward. Josh is the kind of person who, once something bothers him, cannot leave it alone until he understands its full shape. 2 nights after we confirmed the footage had come from Marcus's own equipment, he was up past 1 in the morning doing something I hadn't even considered: reverse image searching individual frames from the video. He found nothing that first night. But he kept at it over the following week, cross-referencing frame grabs against stock footage marketplaces, testing search terms: couple hallway argument authentic, real relationship conflict footage, unscripted engagement fight. Most results were obviously staged content, actors performing conflict for commercial use, easy to dismiss. But on the 4th night, using a slightly cropped frame from our hallway footage as a reverse image search, he found a thumbnail that made him go quiet in a way I'd rarely seen from him. It was us. Compressed, slightly color graded differently than the raw file we had, but unmistakably us, in a preview thumbnail on a stock footage marketplace, under a listing titled Authentic Couple Conflict, Hotel Hallway, Emotional Argument, Unscripted. The seller account was listed under a production company name we didn't recognize at first, until Josh clicked through to the seller's profile and found a portfolio description that used, almost verbatim, the same philosophy language Marcus had used with us in our very first consultation. No performing for the camera. Capturing what everybody else edits out. The account had over 400 video clips for sale. Not just ours. We spent that entire night, and I mean the whole night, until the sun came up, going through what we could access of that seller's public catalog. Most listings were generic B-roll, legitimately useful, unremarkable content, candid laughter, crowd shots, ambient wedding reception footage that could plausibly have been captured with full consent for commercial licensing. But interspersed among them, tagged under categories like raw emotion, real relationship moments, and, this is the phrase that made my stomach turn over, unfiltered vulnerability collection, were dozens of clips that felt exactly like ours. Arguments. Someone crying alone in what looked like a bridal suite. A tense, hushed conversation between what appeared to be a bride and her mother, captured through what looked like a half-open doorway. We downloaded everything we could access as evidence before doing anything else: timestamps, URLs, seller information, the licensing price point, screenshots of the listing description, which, chillingly, described the footage as genuine unscripted emotion, perfect for ads seeking authentic relationship content. Someone had written marketing copy for the worst night of our engagement. 3 days after we started documenting the catalog, before we'd even worked up the nerve to call Marcus, something happened that neither of us expected. I received a message through a professional networking platform from a woman named Priya, not our attorney, a different Priya, a coincidence I still find slightly unsettling, who identified herself as a freelance video editor who had worked for Marcus's production company for just under 2 years, ending about 8 months before our wedding. Her message was short, almost clinical, the way people write when they're deliberately trying not to sound emotional about something that clearly still upsets them. She said she'd seen a comment I'd left on a public forum thread Josh had posted, cautiously, anonymized, asking whether anyone else had experienced something similar with a wedding videographer, fishing to see if we were alone in this. Priya recognized details in the post that matched a pattern she said she'd witnessed directly during her time working for Marcus, and she wanted to talk. We spoke for almost 3 hours on a video call 2 nights later. What she told us reframed the entire scope of what we were dealing with. She said her job, officially, had been general editing, trimming ceremony footage, color grading, assembling highlight reels for clients. But she said a portion of her actual weekly workload, one she said she'd been uncomfortable with from early on but rationalized as just part of the industry because Marcus framed it that way with such confidence, involved reviewing raw footage from weddings and tagging specific clips, arguments, private conversations, moments of visible distress, into a separate internal folder Marcus called, without any apparent self-awareness about how it sounded, the vault. She said Marcus described this footage internally as the company's real asset, distinct from the polished highlight reels clients actually received, and that he'd told her, directly, that this content was worth significantly more per minute in licensing revenue than anything in a standard wedding package, because nobody can fake real desperation on camera, and buyers pay for real. She said she'd raised a concern, once, about whether clients knew this was happening, and that Marcus had pointed her to the contract's select footage clause and told her it was legally covered, the same explanation he'd later give us directly. She said she left the job not long after, telling him it was for unrelated reasons, because she said she was afraid of what pushing back further might cost her professionally in a small, tightly networked local industry. She said she'd carried guilt about that silence for years, and that finding our anonymous post was the first opportunity she'd had to do something about it without putting herself at total professional risk. Priya agreed to provide a written statement to our attorney. It became, according to Denise, some of the single most valuable evidence in the entire case, not because it proved Marcus filmed us without consent, we already had that, but because it proved intent, pattern, and knowledge. It proved this wasn't a gray area misunderstanding of a contract clause. It proved Marcus knew, understood the legal risk, had been warned internally, and had built an entire secondary business around it anyway. That I want to be honest with you about how the call with Marcus went, because it wasn't the dramatic confrontation you might be picturing. It was worse, in a quieter way. Josh called first, told Marcus we'd found something concerning in the footage archive and needed to talk. Marcus's voice, when he called back an hour later, still had that same warm, easy quality it had in our very first coffee shop meeting 3 years earlier, the voice that made us trust him with the most vulnerable day of our lives in the first place. That voice is what made the next 20 minutes so disorienting. We told him what we'd found. The hallway footage on our own hard drive. The listing on the stock marketplace. He didn't deny it existed. What he did instead was worse. He explained it, calmly, as though it were a reasonable business practice we simply hadn't been informed about clearly enough. He told us the contract we'd signed included a clause granting him rights to select footage for professional and promotional use, and that in his interpretation, that extended to licensing. Unidentifiable or difficult to identify B-roll through his production company's stock catalog, which he described as a secondary revenue stream that most videographers in the industry utilize in some form. He said the footage was typically sold with the understanding that it would be used for advertising and commercial projects where the couple's actual identity wouldn't be relevant or disclosed to buyers. I asked him, directly, if he'd told any other couple, a single one, ever, that their wedding footage might end up for sale to strangers. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that answers a question more honestly than words do. He said the language was, in the contract, which is a specific kind of non-answer I've thought about many times since. Then Josh asked the question that changed the entire shape of this story for us. He asked how many other couples' footage was in that catalog. Marcus didn't answer directly. He said something about years of archived work and a substantial catalog, and in trying to minimize his own exposure, he accidentally confirmed something we already suspected from Priya but hadn't yet heard from him directly. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment involving our wedding specifically. This was a business model. A pattern, refined over what he eventually admitted, under further questioning from our attorney weeks later, was close to 6 years and, by his own accounting, somewhere over 90 weddings. 90 weddings. 90 couples who trusted someone with their vows, their tears, their families, their most unguarded hours, never imagining that select footage for promotional use meant their private hallway arguments, their whispered doubts, their grief, would become a searchable commercial product for anyone with $49 and a marketing deadline. Once we filed our initial complaint and Denise put out a public notice through her firm seeking other affected clients, we weren't the only ones who came forward. Several couples reached out over the following months, but one story in particular has stayed with me more than any other, because it made the abstract scale of this feel suddenly, unbearably specific. A couple named Renee and Tom, married 4 years before we were, contacted Denise's office after seeing a local news mention of the case. They told a story that, until that point, I hadn't fully understood was even possible. About a year after their wedding, Renee's sister had been watching television one evening and called her, confused and a little frantic, asking why she was in a national insurance commercial she'd never heard of, let alone filmed. Renee turned on the broadcast in time to catch the tail end of it, a commercial about financial stress in relationships, using a raw, unpolished aesthetic clearly meant to feel authentic rather than staged. The footage was a genuine, private argument about money Renee and Tom had had in their own kitchen the week of their wedding, captured by Marcus during what they believed was simply ambient coverage of their newlywed life together, footage he'd asked to shoot for a few extra candid personal moments as part of an add-on package. Their actual faces, blurred just enough by the commercial's editing to avoid clean identification by a casual viewer, but not blurred enough that Renee's own sister didn't recognize her sister's kitchen, her sister's voice, her sister's exact words about a credit card bill neither of them had ever discussed with anyone outside their marriage. Renee described the feeling to Denise as something closer to an assault than a privacy violation, not because anyone touched her, but because an entire private, difficult night of her marriage had been broadcast to a national audience, for profit, without her knowledge, and had apparently been airing periodically for months before her sister happened to catch it. Renee and Tom's case ended up folding into the broader legal effort against Marcus, and their willingness to speak publicly, alongside ours, is part of what eventually convinced 2 more couples that what happened to them hadn't been some strange, isolated coincidence, but a pattern with a name and finally, consequences attached to it. One of those two couples, a pair named David and Anna, had a version of this story that unsettled me in a different way. Because their footage hadn't been used in an advertisement at all, it had ended up, unlicensed and untraceable to any specific commercial buyer, inside a mental health awareness campaign's B-roll package, used to illustrate relationship strain, with no compensation to Marcus and no consent from Anna and David at any point in the chain. It turned out that once footage like this exists on an open marketplace, it doesn't only get purchased by advertisers with money and legal departments. It gets purchased, sometimes, by well-meaning nonprofits and small production houses who license it cheaply and never think to ask deeper questions about where authentic content actually comes from. David told Denise, during his own initial consultation, that this was somehow the detail that upset him most. Not that someone had profited off his marriage's hardest year, but that his private pain had become raw material for other people's projects entirely without his knowledge, multiplied outward in directions even Marcus himself could no longer track or control. That detail expanded the scope of what accountability even meant in this case. We weren't only trying to stop Marcus from selling footage. We were trying to understand, and where possible undo, a slow leak that had already been flowing outward in directions none of us could fully map. What followed was nearly a year of methodical, exhausting work that looked nothing like the dramatic confrontation we'd had on that first phone call. It looked like spreadsheets. It looked like archiving evidence before Marcus had the chance to quietly scrub his stock marketplace account, which, thankfully, Denise had us do within 48 hours of that first conversation, documenting URLs, timestamps, licensing terms, and purchase availability before anything could disappear. We learned that the specific marketplace Marcus used had relatively loose verification requirements for sellers claiming footage was either staged content or properly licensed unidentifiable B-roll. A gap in the platform's own policy that, frankly, made this kind of quiet exploitation easier than it should have been. Once we filed a formal complaint with the platform directly, along with documentation proving the footage depicted real, identifiable, non-consenting individuals, the platform removed the specific listings within days and suspended the seller account pending investigation, though by that point, we had no way of knowing how many licenses had already been sold, to whom, or for what purposes, in the time the footage had been publicly available. The legal case itself moved through several tracks simultaneously, a breach of contract claim, given that Denise argued persuasively that the licensing clause could not reasonably be interpreted to cover unconsented commercial resale of private, non-portfolio footage, a violation of state privacy statutes regarding recording individuals without consent in spaces where they held a reasonable expectation of privacy, and, given the number of affected couples who came forward, the beginnings of what her office described as a potential class action. The deposition process was, in its own way, one of the hardest parts of the entire ordeal, harder in some ways than the initial discovery. Sitting in a conference room across from Marcus's attorney, answering methodical, repetitive questions about exactly what we'd found, when, how we'd verified it, walking through the hallway footage timestamp by timestamp in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room with a court reporter typing every word, it stripped something private of its privacy all over again, even in service of getting justice for the first violation. I remember Denise warning me about this beforehand, that pursuing accountability sometimes requires reliving the thing you're trying to hold someone accountable for, over and over, in rooms that have no interest in being gentle with you. Priya's statement, entered as part of the discovery process, proved decisive in a way our own evidence alone might not have been. Marcus's attorney's strategy had clearly been built around framing this as a contract interpretation dispute, a disagreement over vague language, an unfortunate misunderstanding. Priya's account made that framing impossible to sustain. Internal folder names. Direct quotes about real assets and desperation being worth more than performance. Documentation of an employee raising a concern and being redirected toward the same contract language Marcus had used on us. That is not the profile of an honest misunderstanding. That is the profile of a business built, knowingly, on the assumption that no one would ever look closely enough to notice. The marketplace platform's own investigation, once it was compelled through legal channels to cooperate more fully, revealed something we hadn't anticipated. Marcus wasn't operating alone in the sense of being an isolated bad actor discovered by pure chance. The platform's trust and safety team acknowledged, in documentation eventually produced for the case, that they'd received at least 2 prior complaints about the same seller account over the preceding 3 years, both of which had been closed without meaningful investigation because the footage in question had been flagged as likely staged content, a category the platform apparently applied by default unless a complainant could definitively prove otherwise, an almost impossible bar for someone who doesn't yet know they're a victim, let alone equipped to prove it. That detail became its own quiet subplot in the broader case, because it meant this wasn't only a story about one videographer's deception. It was also a story about how easy the infrastructure around content marketplaces makes it to wave away exactly this kind of complaint, unless someone arrives with the kind of documentation Josh had spent sleepless weeks assembling that I'm not going to walk you through the full financial and legal resolution in granular detail, partly because a portion of it remains confidential under the terms of the eventual settlement, and partly because the numbers were never really the point of telling this story. What I can tell you is that Marcus's stock footage business was permanently shut down. His seller accounts across multiple platforms were terminated. The specific footage of US, of Renee and Tom, and of every other couple who came forward, was removed, though, as Denise was honest with us about from the beginning, removal from a platform can never fully guarantee removal from wherever it may have already been downloaded, licensed, or archived by a purchaser before that point. That's a hard truth I've had to make peace with, and I want to be honest about it rather than give this story a cleaner ending than it actually has. We got acknowledgement. We got financial resolution. We got a legally binding agreement that Marcus could never operate a videography business again without disclosing this history to future clients. What we didn't get, and what I don't think anyone in our position ever fully gets, is the certainty that it's completely, permanently gone. What helped, more than the legal outcome itself, was what happened after we went public with a shortened version of this story on a local news segment covering the broader pattern Denise's firm had uncovered. More couples came forward after that broadcast aired, enough that at least one state's Consumer Protection Office began examining licensing language commonly used in the wedding videography industry more broadly, not because of us alone, but because our willingness to speak publicly gave other people permission to stop assuming their own experience had been an isolated coincidence. In the months following the settlement, Denise's firm was contacted by a small coalition of wedding industry associations asking for input on model contract language, an attempt, however imperfect, to close the exact gap Marcus had exploited for years. Whether that language becomes standard practice across the industry remains to be seen, and I try not to place too much hope in any single policy shift fixing something this specific. But it was, at minimum, proof that this case had traveled further than our own settlement, further than Renee and Tom's, further than David and Anna's, into rooms where people who write these contracts for a living were forced to reckon with how easily well-intentioned language can be turned into a weapon against the exact people it's supposed to protect. I think that's the part of this I'm proudest of, if pride is even the right word for something that started with so much violation. We didn't just get our own footage removed. We made it measurably harder for this specific method to work quietly, invisibly, on the next 90 couples. And we gave Priya, who'd carried years of guilt over her own silence, a way to finally do something with what she knew. That I haven't talked much yet about what this actually did to Josh and me, as a couple, in the months between finding that footage and reaching any kind of resolution, and I think that's the part of this story that matters most, even though it's the hardest to put into words. There's a specific, disorienting grief in having a private memory turned into a commercial product, because it doesn't just violate your privacy, it changes your relationship to the memory itself. That hallway fight had, over the year before we found the footage, become something small and almost tender in our shared history. A story we told at dinner parties sometimes, self-deprecatingly, about how stressed we'd both been the night before we got married, and how we'd woken up and chosen each other anyway. It was proof, in our own private mythology, of resilience. Finding it for sale took that story away from us for a while. For months afterward, neither of us could talk about that hallway without picturing it from the outside, without picturing a stranger, somewhere, pausing the footage, maybe replaying a particular line, maybe feeling nothing at all, maybe just needing 11 seconds of authentic tension for a car insurance ad. It made me feel watched retroactively, in a memory I'd always believed belonged only to us. Josh described it to me, once, late at night, as feeling like someone had reached backward in time and stood in that hallway with us the whole time, invisible, taking notes. We went to couples counseling for a period during the legal process, not because the discovery had caused conflict between us. If anything, it did the opposite. It made us fiercely protective of each other in a way that deepened things, but because we needed somewhere to put the specific, strange grief of having a shared memory violated in a way neither of us had language for on our own. Our therapist told us something that helped, eventually, that the violation didn't happen to the memory itself. The memory was still ours, still true, still exactly what it had always been between the two of us. What had been stolen wasn't the memory. It was our exclusive right to know who else had access to it. That distinction took a long time to actually feel true, rather than just sound true, but it did, eventually, settle into something we could live with. There was also a quieter, more practical toll that isn't as dramatic as the emotional one but was, in some ways, just as exhausting. Josh, who works in software, ended up teaching himself far more about digital rights management and content licensing law than any person should. To learn out of necessity rather than curiosity. I started, without really meaning to, reading every contract that crossed my desk at work with a level of scrutiny I never used to apply, a habit that's honestly made me better at my job, even though I resent the circumstances that built it. We both, for a while, became people who flinched slightly at cameras in general, at restaurants with visible security systems, at friends filming casual gatherings on their phones, at the specific hum of a camera left running in a room you assumed was private. That reflex has faded with time. It hasn't disappeared completely. I won't pretend the story ends with everything fully healed. There are still moments, sometimes triggered by something as small as a commercial with a certain documentary, handheld camera style, where I feel a flash of that same cold unease from the night I first opened that file. But we made a decision early on that we were not going to let what Marcus did become the defining story of our marriage. It's a chapter. It is not the whole book. The chapter that actually defines us is the one where two exhausted, imperfect 20-somethings had a hard night the week of their wedding and got married anyway, and stayed married, and turned what should have been only theirs into something that ended up protecting 90 other couples' privacy going forward. That's the version of the story I choose to tell myself on the hard days. There's a part of this story I've avoided telling because it's the part that still makes my chest tighten a little, and that's the conversation Josh and I had to have with our own families once we understood the scope of what had been captured that week. It wasn't only the hallway fight that had been sitting in Marcus's archive. Once Denise's team obtained a fuller accounting of what footage Marcus had retained beyond what he delivered to us, we learned that additional private moments from the wedding weekend, footage of my father, alone. In the moments before he had to give a toast about my mother without her there to hear it, footage of Josh's parents having a quiet, tense conversation in a hotel lobby about a family disagreement unrelated to us entirely, one they'd clearly believed was private, had also been tagged and stored in that same internal vault folder, though our attorney confirmed none of it had, as far as we could determine, been sold or licensed the way our footage had. Telling my father that a stranger had filmed him in an unguarded, grieving moment he'd never intended to be seen by anyone was one of the hardest conversations of my adult life, harder in some ways than telling him I was getting divorced would have been, if that had ever come up. He took it quietly, the way he takes most hard things, and then he asked me a question I wasn't prepared for, whether I thought Marcus had understood, even a little, what he was taking from people, or whether it had simply stopped registering as theft to him somewhere along the way, buried under years of telling himself it was just business. I still don't have a good answer to that question. I'm not sure Marcus does either. Josh's parents took the news of their own recorded lobby conversation with a kind of weary resignation that broke my heart a little. His mother said something to the effect of, "I suppose I should be grateful it was never actually sold," and I understood exactly what she meant, and I also understood how low a bar that is to have to feel grateful for. What surprised me most, in the months after we went public, wasn't the legal process or even the settlement. It was the volume of messages we received from strangers, hundreds of them, eventually, who weren't reaching out because they suspected their own footage had been taken, but because the story had made them, for the first time, actually read the fine print on a contract they'd signed years earlier for a completely different kind of service. A therapist who filmed. A reasonable professional will answer that clearly and in writing, without hesitation. If you get evasiveness, or a version of, "That's just standard industry language," treat that as the answer it actually is. Ask, too, whether filming or recording ever continues in shared or private spaces beyond the hours you've explicitly agreed to, hallways, hotel rooms, cars, and get that answer in writing as well. It costs you nothing to ask. It cost us almost everything not to. If you've already had a wedding, an engagement session, any professionally filmed private event, it costs you 15 minutes to do what Josh did. Take a still frame from your own footage and reverse image search it. I hope, sincerely, that you find nothing. Most people will find nothing. But if there's even a small chance you find what we found, I'd rather you know than not. We got our name back off of a stock marketplace. We got acknowledgement that what happened to us was real and wrong, not something we were overreacting to. What we can't get back is the specific knowledge of how many strangers, over how many years, watched the hardest night of our engagement and never once knew our names, and I carry that, some days more than others. If this story affected you, or if you've ever discovered something private about yourself being used somewhere you never agreed to, I want to hear about it in the comments, and I read every single one. If you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and more of what we learned fighting to get answers, every day. A reasonable professional will answer that clearly and in writing, without hesitation. If you get evasiveness, or a version of, that's just standard industry language, treat that as the answer it actually is. Ask, too, whether filming or recording ever continues in shared or private spaces beyond the hours you've explicitly agreed to, hallways, hotel rooms, cars, and get that answer in writing as well. It costs you nothing to ask. It cost us almost everything not to. If you've already had a wedding, an engagement session, any professionally filmed private event, it costs you 15 minutes to do what Josh did. Take a still frame from your own footage and reverse image search it. I hope, sincerely, that you find nothing. Most people will find nothing. But if there's even a small chance you find what we found, I'd rather you know than not. We got our name back off of a stock marketplace. We got acknowledgement that what happened to us was real and wrong, not something we were overreacting to. What we can't get back is the specific knowledge of how many strangers, over how many years, watched the hardest night of our engagement and never once knew our names, and I carry that, some days more than others. If this story affected you, or if you've ever discovered something private about yourself being used somewhere you never agreed to, I want to hear about it in the comments, and I read every single one. If you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and more of what we learned fighting to get answers, every day.